Hi everyone, welcome to another table talk. Today I just wanted to, I'll go back a little bit. A while back I shot a video discussing sort of the top 10 beginner mistakes that I made as a beginner park jet pilot when I first got started. And it actually took me, a couple of years almost to sort of get out of some of those ruts. And I'm human. Some of those mistakes I still make, but not quite as often. So I wanted to just talk about some things that I found have made me a better pilot, better, maybe better builder, but also mostly a better pilot over the last 3 sort of plus years. So, I'm going to talk about what's worked for me, what my philosophy is, what my goals are as a park jet pilot. So, these are all things that have worked for me. I'm not trying to convert anybody to do things the way that I do or anything else. You're fully entitled to disagree with me. But I've just found that these are things that have worked for me. Just mostly sort of food for thought. Maybe it'll give you some ideas of different things that, you might want to try if you're unhappy or you're struggling maybe with something to do with how your park jets are flying or how you're flying your park jets, or maybe kind of any RC plane. So anyway, so a little bit of a background. I've also done, and I'll have links to all of these videos and other things I talk about. I'll have those down below in the show description. So when I first started off in park jets, when I wasn't smashing and crashing my planes up, I had my planes set up almost like a 3D setup where I had huge massive throws, like 2 and 3 inches of travel one way, flying with tons and tons of expo, and I was thrashing around just sort of learning how to fly. But I think after several months of doing that, I didn't feel like I was progressing, and I didn't feel like I was getting a lot of satisfaction out of just slamming the sticks around and having my plane doing my park jet doing sort of very unscale tumbles and rifle bullet rolls and all kinds of other sort of 3D type stuff. So I decided that I really wanted to focus on flying my planes more scale. And what I mean by that is I've watched tons of videos. I also served close to 30 years in the Air Force. So I've seen, for example, the F-18 and other fighters. I haven't seen any of the Russian fighters, but I've seen many fighters, perform at air shows. So, I watched a lot of video, and I really wanted to start focusing on emulating how those planes fly, so to copy and fly sort of in a more scale manner. So I needed to be able to figure out how to fly, a lot smoother. And what I found was happening was, my skill level at the time, the planes I was building at the time, I was having, and the way that I had them set up, I was having a really hard time doing that because I just couldn't find, get things smooth. So anyway, so fortunately, I had got some good advice and also made some fairly significant changes in how I approached the hobby to begin with, and my planes and my transmitter and that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to that's sort of the background of where I was, and now I'm going to talk about sort of how I got where I am now. So I think one of the first things I did was I'm a human being, and it's very easy. Unfortunately, I sort of got trapped a little bit in the forums, RC Powers forums, stuff like that. Sort of seeing these guys that were experienced and flying, doing some really cool things with their planes, and I sort of fell into that rut of how some folks were building and flying and all that sort of stuff, and it wasn't working for me, and I think that that's a pretty logical thing. I mean, if you were to try and build your planes and fly the way that I fly, maybe that's not what you want out of your planes. And if it's not something that you really want and you're really passionate about, if it's a struggle to go out and have fun, I mean, this is a hobby, it's supposed to be fun, you're not going to be dedicated to it. So I had to sort of really I guess, maybe not break away, but I had to sort of decide what my path was and what I wanted to do with my planes, and you know, sort of struck out and tried to figure out what was going to work for me, you know, at that point. So again, you know, very important. I think it's very, very important. I've said this in many of my other videos. I think it's very important. You know, really the only person that I need to keep happy, or you need to keep happy, is yourself. You know, when you're standing there at the field with your transmitter in your hand, your plane's flying around, you know, you should fly the way that you want to fly, and what, you know, gives you pleasure and enjoyment, not how I fly or somebody else flies. You know, and I think that it's easy sometimes for us, or for me anyway, to sort of fall into that pit where you think, oh, you know, this guy looks really great, I want to fly like him. Well, you know, I have no idea what it took for that person to get there. So, you know, I think I had to sort of find my own path. Okay, so that's number one. Picking and sticking with the right airframe. You know, for quite a long time when I first started off, you know, I wanted to build every park jet out there. I wanted to fly every park jet out there, every new one that came along. You know, I was buying the plans and building it. And, you know, I came to sort of realize there were certain aspects of some planes that I really, really just didn't like, or didn't suit the environment in which I fly. And, you know, so I was wasting a lot of time and foam, you know, building every plane that came down the road. And, you know, my hangar was huge. I had, you know, a dozen or more planes. And I never really flew, you know, I wanted to fly sort of each plane equally, but I never really got that good. I never became that good because I was flying so many different, really varying airframes. So I came to realize, and again, these are, you know, my personal thoughts, my personal opinions, and I came to realize that, you know, I really, despite the fact that I guess every once in a while I'll still build a plane with canards, leading edge flaps or slats, single tails. I haven't built with KF2 airfoils in a very, very long time. And, you know, so I still do that. So I don't know, maybe what's the definition of insanity is repeating the same behavior and expecting a different outcome. But I've come to the point now where, you know, I just realized that, you know, planes with canards, leading edge slats, single tails, and KF2 airfoils, they just don't suit the way I want my planes to fly. So I just resist the temptation. Now, you know, it might sound boring. Well, you know, if all I build is MiGs and Su-30s and F-18s, F-22s, that sort of thing, it's going to get pretty boring. Well, in fact, for me, it hasn't been, because you know, obviously, if you follow my channel, I like to tinker and modify planes, and so that sort of stuff never gets boring. But it's a lot easier, you know, if you're comfortable with an airframe and you know the characteristics of how it flies and how it handles, and then, you know, you tinker around and make modifications. It's a lot easier to sort of determine, for me, you know, how did my modifications work? Did it make an improvement? Does it fly better? Does it feel better in the air? Did it make no difference, or did it make it worse? So, you know, hopefully I'm not ever going to get bored, because, you know, every time I build a plane, I learn something from that build, and I throw it in the air and I fly it, and then I think, yeah, you know, I think the next time I build that, you know, maybe I'm going to downsize it a little bit, or I'm going to, you know, try something else. So, and the other thing that, you know, by picking the right plane, most of the planes that I fly are set up pretty much all exactly the same. You know, the same wingspan, same power, you know, very similar power setups. So, you know, there are going to be subtle differences between airframes, but you know, because I keep them within the same size and using a lot of the same power setups, I know sort of what those power setups are going to provide. So then I can determine, you know, the real differences between each airframe, and I end up having fewer planes in my hangar, but I build up more flight time, more stick time with those planes, and get used to them, rather than, you know, building every single plane that comes along. So, you know, over time and over experience, I've just identified, you know, size, type, shape of planes that really work for me, and So I'll have a link down below. On my blog, I've written a series of articles. I think there's about 11 different articles. The first 3 I think are more aimed at beginners. But I've sort of identified things like in my experiences with control surfaces, wing shapes, size, weight distribution, all that sort of stuff. And it's a series I have on my blog called Which Park Jet for Me. So I'll have all of the links to all those articles down below. I did my best when I wrote those articles to stay unbiased, based on some of the things I identified already in this video that I don't really like. But I'm human, and I'm sure that my opinions and things are going to come in there. So anyway, you're fully entitled to disagree with me. That's fine. Okay, so we've hit make myself happy, pick the right plane, and then airplane setup. So like I mentioned, most of my planes are set up very, very similar. So I really started to focus for quite a long time. I didn't really pay much attention to where things were going, where the motor was located, where things were going, servos, that sort of stuff. And as I started focusing on having things more concentrated around the center of gravity, it makes a lot of sense, because my planes started to feel better balanced, and because everything was concentrated close to the CG, the plane just naturally moved and rotated more easily in all 3 axes. My NAMC partner Stefan used to have an analogy where, if you take a carton of eggs and you put take all the eggs out and then put 2 back on either end and spin that carton on the table, it's a little bit more difficult to spin because you've got weight at either end and it's a longer lever. But if you take those same 4 eggs and put them in the center and spin it, it should be a lot easier to spin. So that's sort of the analysis or philosophy there is, having all this as much mass concentrated, because in most park jets, your battery, motor, servos, speed controller, receiver, all that sort of stuff, it accounts for 50 to 60% of the weight of your plane. So if you can have that really concentrated around the center of gravity, in my experience, it really helps the plane respond far more easily. Also, what I started doing, and I did a video on this, but I also started really concentrating on getting my servo resolution better. So I tend to fly with my push rods very close to the servo rather than way out at the end of the servo arm. I also started using different control horns. These are from Flight Test. There's all kinds of different control horns around with more than one hole. So I have a lot of options there to select my travel mechanical advantage between my servo and my control surface by using these. And sometimes it's easier just to move the push rod to a different hole to get the throw that I'm looking for, rather than doing a whole lot of messing around with my transmitter. So there's airplane setup. Okay, so the next one was transmitter setup, and I should actually back up a little bit. My other NAMC partner, Dave Messina, about 3 years ago, introduced Stefan and I to this book. It's Airplane and Radio Setup. It's written by a fellow named David Scott. He runs the first U.S. RC flight school in the United States. It's just an awesome little book. Unfortunately, if you live outside the United States, it's pretty expensive to get. I live in Canada. I paid more in shipping than I did for the book, and I don't think that he has it in an ebook where you could pay and then just download it. But it's an excellent book, and basically the upshot out of that book was focusing, if you want to fly more precisely, is focusing on just stripping things down to the basics. Like I already talked about the airplane setup, I think that park jets fit into sort of the sport aerobatic category of RC planes, again, my opinion. So for me to be able to fly them more smoothly and precisely, I couldn't keep setting them up as 3D planes with tons of travel and tons of expo. I had to do something. So this book would really open my eyes to stripping everything down, to the basics, with a little throw as possible, you know, not having my servos, getting my servos so that they were much smoother, much better resolution, and also in my transmitter. And I did a video where I discussed this, you know, how I became sort of a two-finger pilot, because I used to be, you know, a thumbs, and I sort of over time adopted this more modified pinch method, which I talked about in detail on how I sort of got there. Obviously, I didn't do that overnight. I didn't just all of a sudden, you know, go from 50% expo to 15% expo in the pitch and the roll. You know, I did it over several sessions where I reduced my expo in smaller increments and reduced my throws in small increments as well, and then, you know, flew several planes or several times, several flights, and then reduced again. But what I found is by stripping everything down to the basics like that, reducing my expo, having my throws, you know, as my travels as sort of as small as possible, is I have a much better feel for what's going on with my plane, and my planes tend to fly far crisper, more precise, and more stable, because I don't have these great big huge movements in my control surfaces that, you know, create a lot of drag and turbulence. So it really, you know, again, it took me a couple of months to really get adjusted to it, but since then I just feel like I have a much better connection with my plane, and, you know, I can tell what's going on, that, you know, with the subtleties in it. So that's worked out really well for me. One of the other things that I did as well was, even after I switched to, you know, a different way of holding and handling my transmitter, was I found that with the new method my sticks weren't, it didn't quite feel as comfortable as I wanted to, so I experimented a little bit with sticks. Now most sticks on transmitters, you can actually sort of unscrew them a little bit, although then they'll end up being a little bit loose. But what I did was, these are actually, I picked these ones up from Hobby King. I think they're a couple millimeters shorter than the ones that were stock with this transmitter, and it makes a real difference. So, you know, if you feel maybe you know, these sticks are pretty inexpensive from Hobby King or other places. You know, that could be something that you might want to experiment with. Okay, so there's yeah, keeping myself happy, picking and sticking with the right airframe, setting my airplane up properly to suit my flying style, and then how I set up and program my transmitter. And then, you know, practice. I mean, I know that that's a pretty tired expression sometimes, but, you know, there is no alternative. You know, you can spend as much time as you want on the sim, which is helpful, but it's not going to simulate the experience out at the field. Pardon me. And I also go out to the field. I mean, I know in my videos I'm trying to do these super cool high-speed low passes by myself all the time, because if you watched most of my flights, if I was to videotape one of my normal flights, you'd be bored to tears, because I spend a lot of time covering a lot of real estate and doing all kinds of different aerobatics and focusing on different things. So how I fly in my videos is not really a true representation of how I fly. So lots of times I will go out and I will practice, at least for a couple of flights, I will practice the basics, but I will practice them with a purpose, So, for example, I talked about in my beginner series about the MiG-29 version 1, where, especially if you're a beginner doing like figure-8 style turns, because it helps you see the plane at, several different angles coming towards you, going away from you. So what I'll do is sometimes I'll go out and I will practice those figure-8 turns, and I will try and discipline myself to say, okay, I'm going to set a point, in relation maybe to that tree off in the distance, and I want to make sure that I cross the crossing point of my figure-8 is in that same spot every time. And then as my turns, I want to keep my turns level. I don't want the nose rising and or falling, and and then sometimes I'll vary the speed, try and do them faster, try and do them slower, that sort of stuff. But I'm trying to focus on very specific, to keep things as precise and as smooth as I possibly can. And I'll do that as well with loops, where I'll do, in a flight, I'll try and do several loops where I try and enter the loop, do a nice uniform loop, as round, not egg-shaped, not square at the top or anything like that, and then try and roll out, exit the loop at exactly the same spot, both in altitude and in, laterally. I don't want to be, go into a loop, here and roll out over here. I want to try and roll out in exactly the same spot as where I entered the loop, and I don't want to be too high or too low. And it seems like a simple thing, but sometimes it's a real challenge, and especially if there's a little bit of wind. Sometimes I'll try and practice it in a wind because it's a little bit more challenging, and I have to remember that I have a rudder sometimes. Feed in a little bit of rudder, so that sort of stuff. So I'll do that, and especially if I've had a situation like, maybe in my last flying session, I just wasn't really feeling my mojo, or I had a close call, or, I almost hit the ground or hit myself or the fence or something like that. And then I'll go back to basics and say, if my confidence has been shaken a little bit, then I'll go back to basics and say, okay, I'm just going to come out and do, a couple, 3 flights, and I'm just going to focus on these basics until I, start to feel my confidence and my touch for the plane coming back. So that helps a lot. Okay, so I guess probably the last one, I've talked a lot about, sort of maybe staying within a particular box, but the last one is I have to focus on every once in a while pushing myself outside of my comfort zone. And that might be a more, building what I know is going to be a more challenging plane. For example, the T50 version 5 by RC Powers is probably the most challenging plane in my hangar to fly. It's not, it's not like, throwing a flea in the air and trying to control that. But it's one of those planes that, it's fast and it's agile and it's not as forgiving as some of the other planes in my hangar. So, every once in a while I need to take that plane out and just fly it, and, really, because it really forces me to focus on staying smooth, staying ahead of the airplane, managing my throttle, managing my speed, and it sort of takes me out of my comfort zone. Now, other things, obviously, you watch my videos. Even outside of my videos, I don't spend a lot of time flying around slow, and I don't spend a lot of time doing high alpha. But, they're both very challenging aspects of the flight envelope. Flying slow sometimes, for me anyways, is almost more challenging than flying around, with my hair on fire at full throttle. So there are times where I'll practice that, or, if it's a super calm day and I've got, a decent airplane out there that'll do good high alpha, I'll fly some high alpha, because high alpha, for me, I'm not very good at it, and it's a challenge, and, you're essentially flying the plane, right on the edge of stall. It's a very challenging aspect of the flight envelope, and it really forces me to really stay smooth and focus and concentrate on my, my throttle, my power management, my pitch, because sometimes, depending on the plane, if I pull up just a little bit too much, 2 or 3 degrees angle of attack, the plane's going to stall and fall off. And then I also have to focus, because I'm doing most of my steering with my rudder, which is something that I don't always use, except, maybe on a windier day, or if I'm doing stall turns. It really forces me to be smooth with my rudder, and and concentrate. So it's I guess it's one of the old adage. It's something that, forcing myself to work on my weaknesses, because I'm not all that strong. And it's not because I want to be the best high alpha pilot in the world or anything like that, but it's one of those challenging things that, it just forces me to really focus on my touch. And I think, by doing it every once in a while, it makes the rest of my flying better. So anyway, so there's again, kind of my philosophy on some things that a few years ago, after making all of those mistakes that I talked about in my other video, my beginner pilot, park jet pilot video, and again, I still make a few of those. But these are things that I found have really helped me become a better pilot, and it's something that as I've mentioned here, certain aspects of it, I continue to work on it. You know, I'm always paying attention to, you know, my turns and my loops and my rolls, and you know, if I feel like I'm getting a bit sloppy, you know, then I'll say to my, you know, I'll try and stay disciplined and say, okay, yeah, you know, I'm getting a little sloppy with my turns. I need to focus on keeping those smooth and scale, my loops, my rolls, that sort of stuff. And then, you know, I just sort of, you know, every once in a while we'll set up, you know, watch some video and then set up my own little, you know, air show routine where I'll try and, you know, emulate what I've watched a plane do on video at an air show. So it keeps, you know, it keeps me challenged. It keeps me working on staying smooth, staying focused on what I'm doing. And I think overall has made me a far better pilot. And, you know, I continue to try and work on those little weaknesses as often as I can. So again, please check out the video description down below. I'll have links to the other videos that I've described, as well as the Which Park Jet for Me blog series that I wrote on my blog. So again, you know, just a caveat, these are all things that have worked for me. I know that, you know, things like airplane setup, transmitter setup, these are all very personal items and personal ways of doing things. So again, I'm not trying to convert anybody here. I'm just wanting to share with you my experiences, my thoughts on how I turned a pretty seriously big corner in my park jet career. I guess coming on 3.5 years ago almost, and I've found that my flying has been far more enjoyable and far more rewarding as a result. So there we go, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Blue skies, calm winds to everyone. Park jet noise, the other sound of freedom, baby. Take care.